What if you took a Souls-like game, gave the main character a sword, then gave her a gun, explosives, and supernatural powers, and finally added a mysterious god as a companion? Well, that's basically Flintlock, the Siege of Dawn. And today I'm not going to pretend I finished the game. I've only played around 30 minutes. So this isn't going to be a full review, and I'm definitely not going to pretend that I know the entire story. Instead, I wanted to take you with me through my first experience with the game. Because when I first saw Flintlock, the combination immediately caught my attention. A Souls-like with guns, explosives, magic, and gods. That sounds crazy enough to work. So let's see what the first 30 minutes actually have to offer. Flintlock. The Siege of Dawn is an action RPG developed by A44 Games, the studio behind Ashen. And if you've heard people describe Flintlock as a Souls-like, there's an important detail to understand. This isn't really trying to be another Dark Souls. The game takes some ideas from the Souls genre. Difficult enemies, dodging, timing, checkpoints, exploration, and dangerous encounters. But it mixes those ideas with a much faster and more aggressive combat system. And that's where Flintlock starts to become interesting. Because instead of giving us the usual sword and shield combination, the game gives us gunpowder weapons, melee combat, explosives, and supernatural abilities. And somehow, it puts all of those things into the same combat system. The story takes place in a world called Kian. And Kian is not exactly having a good day. Humanity has been fighting a massive war against supernatural forces, and things become even worse when the door to the Great Below is opened. What comes through that door? The gods, and their armies of the dead. So right from the beginning, the situation is pretty simple. Humanity is fighting for survival. The gods have returned. The dead are everywhere, and the people of Kian are desperately trying to push them back. I really like this setup because it immediately gives the game a strong identity. We're not walking into a normal medieval fantasy world. We're looking at a world where gunpowder technology exists, but gods and magic exist at the same time. And that combination is probably one of the most interesting things about Flintlock. And this is where we meet our protagonist. Her name is Vanek. Nor is a soldier of the Coalition Army, and more specifically, she's a sapper. And I actually like that detail, because Nor doesn't feel like someone who was simply born as the greatest warrior in the world. She's a soldier. She's fighting in a war that is already much bigger than her. And that gives the opening a different feeling. You're not playing as an unstoppable hero. You're playing as someone trying to survive in a conflict, involving forces that are far more powerful than humanity. And very quickly, we get to see just how dangerous that conflict really is. Nor's mission takes her toward the door to the Great Below. The objective sounds simple enough. Destroy the door. But of course, this is a video game, so nothing is going to go according to plan. The opening immediately throws us into a battlefield. There are soldiers, there are enemies, there's chaos everywhere. And the game doesn't spend hours slowly explaining everything before letting you play. You're thrown into the conflict. You start moving, fighting, and learning how Nor works. And this is where I started paying attention to the combat. The first thing I noticed is that Flintlock feels much faster than I expected. If you're coming from Dark Souls or some of the slower Souls-like games, you might expect combat to be very defensive. Wait for the enemy, dodge, attack once or twice, back away, repeat. But Flintlock feels more aggressive. Nor can move quickly. She can attack with her melee weapon, use her firearm, and combine different attacks together. And then there's Enki, but we'll get to him in a moment. The important thing is that the combat doesn't feel like it's asking you to stand still and wait. It encourages you to keep moving, look for openings, interrupt enemies, and keep the pressure on. And then we have something that you definitely don't normally associate with Dark Souls, a gun. Nor's firearm isn't just there because the developers thought it looked good. It actually becomes part of the combat, and this changes the rhythm of fights. You're not limited to getting close to every enemy. You can use your firearm to create opportunities, interrupt attacks, and change the way you approach an encounter. And I think this is one of the areas where Flintlock starts developing its own identity. Because if you remove the gun, the game would immediately feel much more familiar. But once you combine melee combat with gunpowder weapons, it starts feeling like something different. And this is probably the biggest question I have after the first 30 minutes. How far can this combat system actually go? Because the basic idea is really good. You have melee, you have ranged attacks, you have explosives, you have supernatural abilities, and you have mobility. If the game continues building on these mechanics, there could be some really interesting combinations there. But I'm deliberately not going to tell you that the combat becomes amazing later, because I haven't played later, and that's something I want to be honest about. This video isn't a full review. It's a first impression. My first 30 minutes with Flintlock. And then we meet one of the most interesting characters in the game, Enki. Enki is a mysterious fox-like god and eventually becomes Nor's companion. And this is where the story gets interesting. Because think about the situation. Humanity is at war with the gods. The gods are responsible for an enormous threat. And now Nor, a human soldier, is working together with one of them. That's a pretty interesting relationship to start a game with. And I immediately found myself asking questions. Why is Enki helping Nor? What does Enki actually want? Can Nor trust him? And what exactly happened between the gods and humanity? Outside of combat, Flintlock also wants you to explore. And this is another place where I can see the Souls-like influence. You're not simply walking from one cutscene to another. You're moving through the environment, looking for paths, finding enemies, discovering things, and gradually understanding the world around you. I like games that reward curiosity, because when a game simply puts a giant arrow on your screen telling you exactly where to go, exploration can start feeling like following instructions. Here, at least from what I've seen so far, there is a little more room to actually look around. One thing I think Flintlock deserves credit for is its atmosphere. The world feels like it has already been through a disaster. You're not exploring a beautiful kingdom at the height of its glory. You're looking at a civilization that is fighting for survival. Ruins, soldiers the dead, supernatural forces, and the constant feeling that something much bigger is happening. And I think that works really well with the game's story. The world itself feels like evidence of the war. But let's answer the obvious question. Is Flintlock actually a Souls-like? Well, yes and no. It definitely borrows some ideas from the genre. The combat demands timing. Enemies can punish mistakes. Death matters. Exploration is important. And the game expects you to learn from your mistakes. But at the same time, the speed, the gun, the explosives, and Enki's abilities make the experience feel much more action-oriented. So I wouldn't recommend going into Flintlock expecting Dark Souls with guns. It's doing its own thing. And yes, you can die, obviously. This is still a game inspired by the Souls genre. But what I like about difficulty in games, like this, is that dying can actually teach you something. You see an attack, you get hit, you understand what happened, and next time, you try something different. That's the kind of difficulty I enjoy. Not difficulty for the sake of making the player angry, but difficulty that makes you feel like you're improving. Now, after only 30 minutes, I can't tell you where Flintlock ultimately sits on the difficulty scale. But the opening definitely gives you a taste of what it's going to expect from you. So, after my first 30 minutes, what do I actually like? First, the setting. The combination of gunpowder technology, fantasy gods, and undead armies is interesting. Second, the combat. It's fast, aggressive, and has enough different mechanics to make me curious about the possibilities. Third, Enki. I want to know more about this character. And finally, the potential. That's probably the most important word I can use right now. Flintlock has potential. But I'm not going to sit here and tell you that everything is perfect. I've played 30 minutes. That's not enough time to properly judge a game. I haven't experienced the entire story. I haven't seen all the bosses. I haven't experienced the complete progression system. I haven't explored the entire world. And I definitely haven't seen where the story goes. So if you're expecting me to tell you that Flintlock is a masterpiece, I can't do that. Not yet. And honestly, I think that's the fairest way to review games. Don't judge a game you haven't actually played. But I can give you a first impression. Combat 8 out of 10. The combination of melee, gunpowder, and supernatural abilities gives it its own identity. World and atmosphere 8 out of 10. The setting has caught my attention and I want to see more of Kian. Story 7.5 out of 10. The premise is interesting, but after 30 minutes, we obviously haven't seen enough to judge the full story. Characters 8 out of 10, especially Enki. I'm curious about this relationship and where it goes. And overall, my first impression is an 8 out of 10. So after 30 minutes, would I keep playing Flintlock? Yes. And that's probably the most important thing I can tell you. A game doesn't need to convince me that it's perfect in the first 30 minutes. It just needs to make me want to see what happens next. And Flintlock has done that. I want to understand the world. I want to know more about Enki. I want to see how the combat develops. And most importantly, I want to see what happens next. So if you're looking for a Souls-like, but you want something a little faster, something with guns, explosives, magic, and a very unusual companion, Flintlock might be worth taking a look at. But remember, this isn't my final review. These are my thoughts after the first 30 minutes. I'm going to keep playing, and once I've experienced much more of the game, I'll come back and tell you whether that first impression was right or completely wrong. So if you want to follow the journey, subscribe to Panic Roll TV, and tell me in the comments, have you played Flintlock? And if you have, is it worth continuing? I'll see you in the next one. Don't go hollow.